Andrew's a principal engineer with our platinum sponsor, Launch Scout. Go ahead, round of applause for Launch Scout. Yeah. Andrew trains apprentice software devs, builds stuff using Elixir, Ruby, and JavaScript. And without further ado, here's Andrew Eck with Better Forms with LiveView. Round of applause. Come on, you can do better than that. That was a little weak. There we go.
All right, hi everybody. Happy Friday. Glad to see you all. And for you to be able to see things. Even better this time. I'm Andrew Eck. We are going to talk about forms and LiveView. I'll show my contact details again later. The code is also available in case it is of interest. So, the thesis behind this, and I'm going to move a little bit quickly, both because there's a lot of things and because I'm excited about dinner. But the thesis behind this, LiveView, and frankly Elixir in general, give us a fantastic developer experience. The feeling of writing Elixir code is relative to Ruby or PHP or JavaScript or PHP or C# or Java or any of the other languages that I've worked with professionally is just, it feels better. I write more readable code, more understandable code, clearer code, easier to change code. It feels good. It's pretty cool. LiveView also gives us a really excellent developer experience. The feeling of writing LiveView code is pretty cool. That said, I think that there's still a fair amount of room to explore as far as delivering a really high-quality user experience with LiveView. And I think in general, I mean, there's people contain multitudes, infinite multitudes. There's a lot to explore about how to better serve people. And so within the context, the thing that's kind of motivating this talk is that in most of the software that I work on, I usually work on internal line of business software that helps more and more people run their business. The most significant interactions they're typically creating are through forms. So it stands to reason then that we should pay attention to forms. So the agenda for today. The first thing is we're going to briefly characterize some of what I know to be at least pretty good practice in terms of working with forms. Best practices, I think somebody said this earlier, best practices are extremely dependent on context. A best practice in one context is not necessarily a best practice in another context, but there are things that are pretty good most of the time. I feel comfortable saying that. There are at least a couple of things that are pretty good most of the time. The second is we want to see, relative to where LiveView is right now, where are we in comparison with that, kind of ideal, also in a vacuum, ideal thing. And then finally, I want to do a little bit of discussion around making technical choices in Elixir and Phoenix code bases with regard to, am I going to use LiveView for this form, or should I consider something different? And again, these won't be hard and fast rules, just like things we might consider. We'll get into it. Let's talk about some form practices. The first one, the error message, ideally, should be close to the input. If you want a user to fix a thing, the thing that we tell them that they need to fix a thing should be pretty close to the thing that they're fixing, ideally. And this probably feels obvious, but also I am a person who has used software in the world, as are you. And I've written crappy software. I will continue to write crappy software from time to time. On the days I don't write crappy software, it's because I'm not writing software that day. The second one is the form should reasonably map to the user's mental model of the domain. I use Vim as my daily driver. I'm in the terminal. I try to not touch my mouse at all, strictly out of being pedantic. I have an insanely high tolerance for unintuitive user interfaces as a result. And I have written, in my work as a software developer, a number of unintuitive user interfaces. But they make total sense to me because I'm like, yeah, this is what the database columns are like. Of course, this makes sense. Of course I need the ISO 8601 date time string. Why not? But it should map to the user. Right? It should map to like who's the human actually using the thing. It should map to that. Ideally, we're using labels, semantic HTML inputs. There's some really cool things that have been going on in the last 10 years around semantic HTML inputs. It's pretty cool. We'll talk about a couple of them. And we should be gracefully recovering from errors. If the user submits a thing, and it breaks, they should know about it. If they close their computer and then reopen it, ideally the thing doesn't break. Maybe it does, but ideally it doesn't. And then also, errors should be shown at the appropriate time. And we'll get into that in just a second. And we shouldn't disable the submit button. Like, I don't know if this is going. I'm going to click the submit button, see what errors there are. Yeah, perfect. I love that flow. I unironically love that flow. So as far as timing, we want to show error messages to the user when we know that there is an error, but not sooner. We're going to come back to this. So we should show the errors on submit, ideally, other than just like, it didn't work. What's up? If we're really clever, then when somebody clicks into a field, they type a thing, and then they click away. If that field is in an error state, we show the error message then. And if we're really, really clever, then after the submit, or after they click away, but then go back into a field and change it, if they change that field into an error state, we show the error message immediately rather than waiting for the next blur. That's if we're really, really clever. You can do with like React form hook as an example. I'm going to like bring up React and JavaScript at an Elixir conference. With React form hook, for example, it more or less works this way most of the time. Not perfectly, but you can get it pretty close to this. So let's play with some Elixir. How do you do this LiveView? I'll show you the first variation. This one's terrible. Just this terrible is a teaching example, not like, yeah, terrible is a teaching example. Got an invoice. I was remarkably unclever. Should be an invoice number, an email address, some sort of due on, an amount in cents, because we are storing our amounts in cents in the database to avoid floating point nonsense. If you haven't been bitten by floating point math, just like do some more floating point math and wait. Yeah, it's all good. So pick an invoice number. I'm just going to go with one. Some email that's not real. A due on. We got my ISO 8601 date string. Let's go 515, an amount in cents, some number. Let's go. Invoice number's been taken. Okay. Let's change it to 2. Let's change it to 3. Change it to 7,777. There we go. That was terrible. That gets even worse. So we can say things like the due on can't be blank, and if I go due on Thursday, it's going to tell me the due on is invalid, but it's Thursday. That's real. That's real. Or the email address. Do something like this. Must be a valid email address. This is an obnoxious experience for the user. And the thing that makes it obnoxious is largely total disregard for the user. But more concretely, we're doing some saving. We assign errors. We've got a couple of inputs. You'll note text input, text input, text input. These are just using the Phoenix HTML form helpers. We have labels. Those are nice. I love a good label. But this is not an excellent experience. And so it works, but we have some problems here, and this will be a recurring theme. The big one is that the validations are really far from their fields. If we look back, the amount in cents is up there, the due on is up there, the invoice number, the recipient email, those aren't even in the same order. And like for this form, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. But if you're filling out like, I am at the doctor and I'm filling out my paperwork ahead of going into the doctor and it asks me 800 questions, yeah, good luck with something like this. It's not gonna, users are just going to stop. They're gonna say, oh, I didn't get the link. Just give me the paper one. I didn't get the link. That's what's going to happen. I can say that confidently from experience. That is exactly what's going to happen. So, it's one of our problems. We validate only on submit, which actually isn't that bad. That's how the web worked up until very recently. You can just validate on submit, that's fine. Some of the inputs, for example, the invoice number, that one has to be unique. It's hard, we don't help the user at all to find a starting number. Just like, yeah, guess. Okay, guess again. Okay, guess again. Okay. Then the inputs require some special knowledge. For example, that date stamp, the ISO 8601 date string. I know about it because I spend time reading ISO standards for fun. But I would not expect somebody who doesn't have that special technical knowledge to know. Why would they? They have no reason to, which is like the vast majority of humanity has no reason to know about this, which is exciting. So, second variation, we've improved a couple of things. One thing that we will have improved, and I'll show you the form itself, is that we're now using like email inputs and date inputs. So we can use some of the browser's native semantic HTML inputs to give ourselves a little bit better of a time. Whenever I join a brand new project, this is one of the first things I look for, is like, with these forms, are we using semantic HTML inputs? And that's usually a pretty good how much of a mess am I walking into indicator, along with test coverage, like those two together. It's usually a pretty good indicator. Then we're doing a couple other things. For example, we will be putting the invoice number just as a starting value. So let's take a look at the form. Sorry, I'm using Tim's computer because my computer is broken and all of the buttons are different. So we're just going to kind of run with it and see what happens. Oops, nope. Okay, form 2. So the highest invoice number is 7777. I got 7778. It's all good. The recipient email, if I do something like this, and I try to submit, the browser itself is going to tell me, hey, not an email address. This is an email input. It's an input with type email. We've got the handy date picker. And we can still go. We can create the input. It works. Or create the invoice, sorry. It works. The feedback wasn't great, but all the data is there. This is about what you would expect if you're doing a conventional like Phoenix controller with a form rendering. It's about what you would expect. Right? This is not terrible. It's not amazing, but it's not terrible. Going back, we can do things like that with the amount and cents. One thing with the browser is if you when you have these fields, if you have constraints on the fields, it'll stop at whatever the top one is. So if I click submit right now, my submit action doesn't fire. The browser blocks it because it has this type submit. It's kind of cool. So we go from here, we'll pick a date. We'll go. And we still see this error message like must be greater than 0. Not bad. Not bad. If I try to make this invoice 1, has already been taken. Our errors are right next to our fields. This isn't bad. The styling isn't great. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the styling because it's a teaching example, but it's not bad. Okay. And then the other thing, we'll talk about this in a second. There's this phx disable with attribute, which is pretty exciting. One thing that happens with slow forms is you'll have users who just like mash the button, right? This isn't working. I'm going to mash the button. I think it should work. I'm just going to mash. And in some cases, that's okay if you've got like your idempotency keys and things like that going. In other cases, it's not great. So Phoenix gives us kind of a neat thing, and we'll just look at this right in the code. Let's quit this. Oops, nope, that. Using someone else's Vim is just a thing. Just a thing. That's okay. Okay. We can simulate this. I got this trick from Bruce Tate and Sophie DiBenedetto's book. In the handle save, let's do, whoops, nope. Here we go. Someone else's Vim. Timer.sleep, let's say 2 seconds. We'll save this. Oops. Go back to our code. We can just pass in an email. Thank you for the autofill, Tim. Do valid sense. And then check this out. When we save, the button disables with saving. Normally, because it's like all local, it happens so fast you're not going to see it. But in the real world, we are constrained by the speed of light, going distances further than from our machine to our machine. So it's sometimes useful to have that. Oh, sorry? Oh, probably do. No, it's right there. Yep, we're right there. We're all good. All good. Okay. So relative to the version 1, we're showing the errors in the right spot. That's exciting. We're providing a sensible default number. Also exciting. This is a case of just like helping the user a little bit. When we can help them a little bit. We're using semantic inputs, which is pretty cool. When we have those semantic inputs, like we're also helping the user to input better data. And we're handling that slow submit just a little bit better. But we still have a couple of problems if we choose to go looking for them. One, the dev experience just isn't that great right now. If we look at, oops, nope, that's caps lock. If you look at the code, we've got a bunch of these divs here. I can make that just a little bit bigger. Got a bunch of these divs here. And this isn't terrible, it's just not excellent. Oops. We still don't handle disconnects. If I disconnect this form, and we can see that in just a second, when it remounts, it's going to just wipe all of my data, which is pretty fun. So we don't handle disconnects very well. And the validation's still only shown the submit, which is, not terrible, actually pretty normal relative to the internet, but not as good as it can be, probably. I'll show you what those disconnects look like. If we go back to the form, I'll fill this out real fast again. This is just going to be a process. Okay, we've got everything in there. I'm going to open up the DevTools, and oh my gosh, Tim, what are you doing with life? Okay. Open up the DevTools. Here we go. Do a live socket.disconnect. You see the little flash message? Can't find the internet. This the live socket is just a connection between the page and the server. That's how the live view happens. And then a live socket.connect, and watch what happens to the form. Boop, it's gone. This is the teaching example. We're filling this thing out like 90 times, so I don't care. But if I had just filled out, say, 800 fields, or 90 fields, or some non-trivial number of fields, or fields under time pressure, I might be a little bit cranky if this happened. It is possible that I might be a little bit cranky. I would expect the browser to hold that state if I didn't do anything to change it, independent of whatever the server is doing. Yeah, it might be a little cranky. So it's a tiny problem, We're going to fix this. So with variation 3, excuse me, we're going to do validate. In order to make the error messages show up, like in those error tags, you need to have an action in your change set, which is that line, just that map.put action. It doesn't have to be validate. It could be like literally any atom ever. It just has to be something other than nil. And then we're also doing an ID. So we've got this phx change, validate. That's going to keep, that's going to fire off a validate event. We can work with that in a second. And then the ID lets us know when we remount, how do we make all this happen? And basically when it remounts, what I think happens is it's firing another like update event, basically. So it's kind of exciting. And what that means then is, here we go. We're going to see the same form, almost the same form. One thing we'll see is when we start typing, because we're doing the validate, all those error messages show up at once. And this is what I remember my experience of like doing this type of live validation with LiveView the last time I got to work on production Elixir code, which was like 6 or 7 months ago. And this is where I was like, oh gosh, here's where we're starting. Let's talk about this as a thing. So we're still seeing these error messages, and these are things that need to be fixed. amount in cents, the error messages go away. Should be good, and we are good in this case. We should be good. Make the invoice, it all works. If you go back to it, let's open up our inspector again. Oops, I'm just going to do that live socket disconnect. We still have the data here. Last time it all got blown away. This time, it persists. We keep the DOM. How great. So even if this is as far as you get, right? This is, if I were writing internal tooling for internal users who are just like down the hall from me, this is probably how far I would go, right here. They can just deal with the error messages, and I can say it's not you. This is just how the system goes. It gets a little bit better, though. Over the last couple of minor LiveView releases, we've seen some even better improvements. And we'll talk about this. So to recap variation 3, we show the errors in real time. We handle disconnects much more gracefully, but we still have some problems here. The dev experience is still not great with regard to how the forms go. The errors show on the first key press, and I was showing this to my wife last night. And as soon as I got to like the email address, she was like, "Oh, I don't like that." And my wife is almost always right. So this is like, worth taking into account. And we're still not totally helping the user do the right thing. Let me show you what I mean by that. So for example, with the amount in cents, I can, whoops, what's going on here? I can make that like anything. With the due date, I mean, we don't have any validation of the due date other than it being present. We can make that almost anything. So we still have some help that we can do to get the user doing the right thing. And we still have the problem, frankly, of like, this is an amount in cents. This is my database leaking into my form, not something different. Still a problem. Not as big of a problem as lots of other problems, but it is still a problem. So we'll talk about variation 4. The big thing that happened it's one of the 2 most recent releases of LiveView, is we got this like to-form bit, which is really exciting. And the thing that it does is instead of assigning your change set and creating the form off of your change set, where what we were doing before here we go. What we had been doing in the form, and if you look right at kind of the top, it had been like for at change set before. Now it's a form. And the cool thing here, this is a Phoenix LiveView form or something like that. We can inspect it. The really cool thing that happens is it is tracking the fields and whether or not they have changed. Right? And this is awesome. It's so cool. This is the thing that when I first pitched this talk idea to Bruce, this is the thing that I thought I was going to build, and then I read the docs and saw it already existed and was like, well, crap. Now what am I going to do? And still here, but here we go. Let's look at it. Let's look at it. I'm going to get rid of this bit. Okay. So with this do on, we changed it. Note, those error messages aren't showing up. Right? The error messages aren't showing up yet. And if I type here, as soon as I start typing, then it like kind of goes, kind of disappears. If I type, or if I touch the field, type something, the error message shows up, and I go away, the error message stays, which is kind of exciting, but the other error messages don't go. This is kind of cool. So this is actually, right now, how far I would go for internal tooling. I'd be pretty comfortable doing so. But it all works. Okay. You can go. Now this is the piece that I'm actually really excited about. There are some limitations here, though. For example, and this is actually the thing that I showed my wife, like first key press must be a valid email address. Bro, I just typed a single character. We can make this a little bit better. And then also, if this field is, if we're looking like the very best of what other form libraries are doing, clicking into the thing is sufficient for it to be touched, which is then sufficient for it to show error messages in the way that we described earlier. Whereas right now, clicking into the thing, here, I'll reset this, clicking in here is not sufficient to trigger, and clicking in here and then clicking away, is not sufficient to trigger the error message. It's just like clicking in. Just clicking in and then making a change. So relative to version 3, relative to the previous variation, we're showing the errors in a more timely fashion. We're not just like dumping all the errors at once. We're letting the user kind of work through it. We've improved the developer ergonomics. Ooh, I forgot about the form, the input components. So relative to, here we go. We're using the new generated input components. And you can do something like, these are the ones that come if you do a base Phoenix new project creation with the latest version of Phoenix. It's not too hard to change them. We're not gonna spend a ton of time working with them, but if you look at this relative to a div with a label and an input and an error message, this is more pleasant. And the cool thing here is that it is wrapping, here we go, yeah. It's wrapping this in a PHX feedback for div, which means that the changes that happen inside that form propagate somehow back up to the little form struct, and it's all really cool. It's really, really cool how this happens. This is straight from generated Elixir code. I copied and pasted, that's all I did. So, we're pretty good here. We still have a couple of problems. One is that our dirty clean state isn't quite right, or like our touch dirty clean state is not quite right, and that's one that that's a nut that I've not been able to crack yet with LiveView. I think it's crackable, I just haven't yet. We're not yet helping the user like really, really do the right thing. The accessibility here isn't great. All the error messages are just coming, like the error messages that come up and the rules for how all that works are like happening elsewhere in a way that doesn't always translate to screen readers. We're still running the uniqueness query, and I'm not gonna worry about that too much. And we're still like amount and sense. One thing that we can do is we can use HTML attributes. The HTML input attributes as defined by the W3C. The MDN docs list this pretty well. Where, for example, with the invoice number, we can say it is a required field and has a minimum value of 1. And this is going to duplicate a little bit of the validations that we're doing in our change set. I don't care even a tiny bit about the duplication. I will happily repeat myself if it's useful. I was a middle school teacher for several years. I will happily repeat myself if it's useful. We can do things like the email input, which we talked about before. And we can even, we'll get to this here in just a second. Yeah, we can work with these things in a way that gives us much better feedback from the browser. When I show this to designers, they freak out. Because they'll say, wait, why is, oops, here, where are we? Oops, not here. Version 5. I'm just going to submit this without worrying about it. They'll say, wait a second, wait a second, wait a second. I don't see that on the mocks. That's not on the mocks that we drew. That's what, they'll say that. And it's totally okay. It's totally okay. It's because it's a function of like not knowing the tools that are available is what it actually is. So it is not a symptom of being overly precious about design. It is a function of there is more about HTML that I know. And we can have these conversations. This is awesome for screen readers. And unlike Domino's Pizza, I intend to not get sued for accessibility stuff. So, you know, it's all good. So this works. We're going to plow forward just a little bit. I'm not going to worry about showing the rest of this. They're going to work the same as it has. The big one here is that the amount and sense is still a problem. Like, this is still the database leaking into the form in a way that's going to feel weird and hostile to the user. When we write code, it is useful to ask, am I writing this code for other software developers? Am I writing this code for end users? What do those end users know? What do the software developers know? Right? Who is actually going to be using the thing that I'm making? For a lot of the work that I do, I'm writing code that other developers will use to write code that other developers will use to do things for the user. But that's not the case here. Here we've got like humans right on the other side. We got to make sure that we're working with them and working for them. And so, oh yeah, also the email validation is aggressive, but we can work with that. So we've got one last two less tricks. One is that if you are working with this, you can selectively add the phx debounce equals blur. And what that'll do is it'll mean that for fields with just that attribute, they're not going to validate immediately. They're going to wait till you click out. It is useful to balance, am I doing this for all fields? Am I doing this for just this field? Am I doing this everywhere? It's a useful question to ask. You know, what user experience are we looking for? What is less disruptive to the user? And or how much disruption can we ask the user to tolerate while guiding them to doing the right thing? Is maybe a different question to ask. And what that ends up looking like, here, if it was 6, we're just gonna worry about the email. So if I type, no error message, blur away, error message, come back. Now notice before what would happen is as soon as I got here, this is not a real email address, but a valid email address. As soon as I got here, what had happened before is the error message went away. What's instead going to happen, because of that debounce, is as soon as I tab away from it, the error message goes away. So it's a trade-off it's worth asking for. Like, to what extent do we want like super timely feedback that's a little bit gentler? Or sorry, to what extent do we want very timely feedback that's like aggressive versus gentler feedback? I would expect there to be like further work done in this realm in LiveView over the next several years, but yeah, it's a question to ask. Okay. The other thing that's kind of exciting is we can go with an amount in dollars. There's some magic behind the scenes where we create amount in dollars as a virtual field on the schema, validate it, and then assuming that it's valid, multiply it by 100 and turn it into an integer, and then dump that into the amount in cents field, which then separates database from user, just a little bit, in a way that's useful. And if we do something like this, really cool things happen. Check this out. Okay, this is actually Andrew fangirling about semantic HTML inputs is the actual title of this talk, but here we go. Okay, so with the amount, this is in dollars. I'm still gonna get, like that, must be greater than 0. And if I try doing something like this, here, $123.78.787, let's say. We click create. Check out that browser validation message. Please enter a valid value. The nearest disappeared. The nearest two values are like, what was it, 0.78 and 0.79, I think was what it said. Something very close to that. Cool, huh? That's thrilling that we can do that. The way that works is through the, through the step attribute. The step, like when you're clicking up and down, or in some browsers scrolling, it'll determine how much up and down to go with each like button push, but it also sets precision. Your browser's great. I love being out of the browser wars. It's great, unironically. And then because this is a virtual field, it's treated by our change sets as just another field. You can virtual fields all day if you want. It's great. It still carries through. Our state actually lives on the page. It's all good. Okay. Let's, whoops, too far. Okay. In the interest of time, we're going to speed through this. I'm happy to show this later. I've gotten really into like composable ecto queries and also composable change sets, and I will gladly talk at length about that at a different time. But the thing that we're looking at here, mostly is that form validation is hard. We have a number of things that we're looking at. Forms are still going to be the primary way that our users interact with applications, which means that we need to take special care with them in a way that we don't always have to with like just a show page or whatever. The validation messages and the feedback that we give to users is the way that they know if they're doing it right. If we don't give them that messaging, they don't know. And in general, depending on the length of the form, the complexity of the form, we may want to make strategic decisions about how soon we show them that feedback versus not how soon. There are some forms, like a search form, for example, you're not going to have an invalid search query. You can go to Google, you can type in literally any string. It's not invalid. But with like business logic, you will have invalid search queries. You will have invalid data, and we need to make sure that we're showing that. And the thing that we have as a dial is kind of balancing the developer experience versus the user experience. Going much further than what I showed here is, as far as I can tell, outside of the bounds of what I can easily do with LiveView, easily being the key here. It isn't that LiveView is limited, it isn't that Elixir is limited, it's just that if I want to get like a really, really excellent like Apple level or Uber level or like Uber the company, like that level of extremely heightened, elevated polish, I probably can't get there in an afternoon with LiveView. Just isn't going to happen. That doesn't mean LiveView's bad. It just means here we are. In general, I think that predictable is easier to get to than perfection. And so, and again, for most of my internal line of business applications, investing in making something that's like predictable and easy to act on is better than like finding that elevated polish. It's a better use of like what's typically a fixed budget project. But again, it's worth knowing the limitations of what we can deliver. We should explore those limits. We should explore those limits. That's how you know where they are. That's how you start pushing them further. That's how you start being strategic. But there are limits, and it's worth paying attention to that. I think within LiveView itself, limitations that we have right now in terms of like why I would use LiveView, why I would not use LiveView, if I had users who are limited by latency. So every one of those like handles the PHX validate like callbacks requires a round trip to the server. If I were limited by latency, which for most of my stuff I'm not, I'm working with people at their desks, but if I were, I probably can't use LiveView right now. If I needed incredibly elevated user experience, I probably can't use LiveView for everything. I might have to get a little creative about like getting React in there or getting some JavaScript library. I might have to be a little creative with that. There's great work out there. Steve Bussey in his book, Real-Time Phoenix, had some good work with like linking up sockets with LiveView. Chris Nelson has some really cool like live elements, live state stuff, also about getting JavaScript integrated within LiveView in a way that's really exciting. But we're like cutting edge. This is a small community. We've got a relatively small number of people who are working on things. And there's only so much effort that can be applied to any one problem at any one time. It's not bad. We've done a lot of really cool stuff. But it's just where we are. And so, within all of that, I think the big thing that I might suggest taking away, other than please use semantic form inputs if you can, semantic HTML, please, 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 would just be pay attention to what those dials are. You know, to what extent do I care about being able to produce a thing quickly, which if I'm using LiveView, I usually can, versus to what extent do I care about putting out a thing that's incredibly polished, and where do those, like, where's the business value within that? Where is, or you know, my personal values, or whatever the case may be. And that informs our choices, which is pretty exciting. I'm over time, but I'm looking forward to seeing you all at dinner. Thank you so much.